Hello everyone, I'm going to do another question and answer session. This is our 15th for the channel, so without further ado, I'll get into your latest questions. Given all the additional revelations pointing to Lucy's innocence since you first pitched your book, have you given any thought to strengthening the title, for example, from reasonable doubt to more than reasonable doubt, or undoubtedly unreasonable or some such? Well, it did really occur to me that overwhelming doubt would be a perfectly reasonable way of describing it. But of course it's titled that way to reference the traditional court instruction. Also, I didn't come up with that title. Someone suggested it to me a very long time ago, one of the very first people I interviewed for the book. And as soon as this person said it, I thought, yeah, that's perfect. So I just stuck with that ever since. So there are kind of logical reasons why we call it reasonable doubt, but I think it doesn't truly convey the level of doubt, certainly. So you could title it otherwise, but no, I didn't really give it serious thought. I just thought this is an appropriate title. So this was asked as a question to the live stream, but I'll answer it here. What are the top 3 pieces of new evidence that are likely to have the most sway in overturning the verdict from a legal point of view? This is a good question. There are quite a lot, and firstly, I'm not necessarily privy to everything that's been submitted, and secondly, I wouldn't like to try to rank them, to be honest. What I can say is that the insulin study is critically important and the new evidence that's put forward, because it essentially demonstrates that it's new scientific research, it's new scientific understanding that shows that what was initially believed to be extraordinary insulin results are not extraordinary in a neonate. And that is critically important because that's the closest you get to having a solid piece of evidence in the court case. So therefore, that trumps everything else. There's other important things, but there is no doubt that this is fresh evidence, new evidence, as you describe it here. And that will be critical to Lucy's exoneration, without doubt. Chris, do you know why only child K was retried? Was it on request from the parents, the hospital doctors, judge, or CPS? I find it strange that only that one was retried, since there was no verdict on other counts as well. So I guess the short answer to your question is no, I don't know why it was retried. So any answer I give here is speculative. I think it's extremely doubtful that it was on request from the parents, because I don't think the parents would say, put me through more trauma than I've been put through already. And if it was on request from the parents, then why wouldn't the other parents of the other children want their case to be retried as well? I very much doubt it's on request from the hospital and doctors, because they should have no input into the judicial process whatsoever. I don't know about the judge. Well, sorry, let me say it's very doubtful to come from the judge. The judge doesn't really care about the verdict. The judge is just there to ensure that the trial is run in accordance with the law, essentially. The Crown Prosecution Service can have some input, but I think fundamentally this came from the police. I think they were already realising that we're starting to come under fire, and I believe that this case was retried to keep people quiet for a few months, or quite a few months. I don't think it would have emanated from the CPS. I think it would have emanated from the police, and the CPS would have approved it. I must say, as a disclaimer, that I don't know anything about this at all. I don't have any inside information. I don't have any indication. There are some other possibilities. I think one possibility is to try to get a conviction that doesn't involve the evidence of Evans. However, again, I don't know. That's just speculation. Who knows? Ultimately, it's impossible to say. Only those involved will ever know. They will probably never get to find out why. All I can say is it should never have been retried. You've seen how bad the evidence is. It was absolute debacle. And very regrettable and very embarrassing for everyone involved, frankly. Another question I have is about when it came to light that Dr. Brearey had done the needle aspiration on child O. If I remember rightly, it was only Dr. V who first mentioned it. Was that during the trial or at Thirlwall? I've never seen Dr. Brearey himself talk about it or be questioned about it, although I haven't read his statements yet. So, in answer to your question, this came out through the Thirlwall Inquiry. Of course, it would have come out anyway, even if it wasn't for the Thirlwall Inquiry, because sooner or later it probably would have become evident. But of course, I don't have the clinical notes in front of me. I don't know what is in the clinical notes. All I know is that this document is at the Thirlwall Inquiry and it gives indication. I don't know how the panel have derived this conclusion that it's likely that there was a needle laceration during the treating of the liver. By the way that the liver was treated was fundamentally incorrect. This is discussed at some depth in my book with some experts commenting. So it definitely came to light at Thirlwall. It definitely wasn't in the trial, and you certainly never heard Dr. Brearey talk about it because it wasn't part of the court process. It's hardly the kind of thing he's going to bring up in his essentially self-promotional media interviews, and he hasn't commented since the court case. So I think that pretty much answers your question. Also, I can't see that Dr. Brunton has talked about or been questioned about the phone call mix-up during child D's resuscitation. I only saw that from the parents' Thirlwall statements. I don't think it's been established which nurse actually held up the phone. One parent claimed it was Lucy, but I'm not so sure about this, and I don't know if it has been established who left the baby without the stomach bag attached and why. I guess Thirlwall doesn't really care about that. So to deal with the first issue, or the first comment first, I know I've mentioned this incident on the channel previously. I think it was quite some time ago now. I don't think I even included it in my book because you can't squeeze everything in there. It's impossible. And it's an issue of relative triviality. I don't think it has been established which nurse actually held up the phone. It's incorrect that it was Lucy, but I just didn't discuss that because it's such a kind of non-issue. I didn't feel it was worth including. I've spoken about the eyewitness accounts and how some of them were inaccurate. If I was to go through every single one that was inaccurate and why it was inaccurate, that would double the size of that chapter, and it's a long enough book as it is. So it hasn't really been established. It's just more nonsense in the court case, essentially. Again, I don't think it's been established who left a baby without the stomach bag attached and why. I think that Thirlwall began with a very clear narrative, and it never really had, in my view, an investigative or exploratory remit. Their job was, the terms and conditions were set out, a narrative was created around those terms, the public inquiry absolutely reflected that. So they didn't question this type of thing. There's all manner of absolute rubbish in Thirlwall, and things being added to the court case, and Lucy being treated as guilty for cases where she was found not guilty in court. There's all sorts of crap that's gone on. It's an absolute disgrace, that inquiry, particularly as they had so many documents that indicate that the situation was completely different from how they were going about conducting the public inquiry. The public inquiry is a joke, and that's why she can't release the report. And I don't often speak that strongly about it, but it's just a fact. Evans cited setting up a neonatal unit as evidence of his expertise in that field, but it could be interpreted as demonstrating a lack of expertise, which needed to be corrected, and there is a lot of admin in setting things up. Was that his role? I don't think we'll ever know the answer to this question again. Obviously, he likes to inflate his credentials. And let me say something conciliatory, because I've not said too many positive things about him or about what he's done. There's no doubt that he was a qualified paediatrician, and I'm sure he has dealt with neonates in some capacity, and I'm sure that he believes that he has the ability to work on a neonatal unit, or would have had the ability at the time that he was a paediatrician. I can't really comment on his expertise or what is meant by setting up a neonatal unit. I agree that there can be administrative or organisational capacity to this, which doesn't really involve any clinical practice. I'm sure if Dr. Evans would come on this channel, which he definitely won't, because I've tried to engage with him and I've tried to ask him, I've made it clear to him I have questions to ask him and would he be willing to answer them, and he's made it very clear that he won't, which is fine. But I'm sure if he did come on this channel and I put that to him, he would very strongly emphasise that he has clinical experience and knowledge of clinical practice. I'm sure he would come down very strongly on the suggestion that he just worked in an administrative capacity. Whether or not that's true or not, it's impossible for me to say. All I can say is he wasn't an appropriate witness for the court case and he shouldn't have been involved in the Lucy Letby case. Do you think the doctors didn't expect it to go this far, but then Dewi Evans got involved and they had to come up with something? An interesting philosophical question. It's obviously impossible for me to know exactly what was going through the minds of the doctors in 2015, 2016, 2017. All I can document is what happened, and I've done that, and I can comment on their conduct. I can't comment on their thinking. It's just impossible. That we can infer certain things, but we can't know for sure. So again, I don't know the answer to this question, but if they're in the police station speaking with the police on the 15th of May, they must think there are legitimate reasons for a police investigation. So therefore, it can't be that surprising to them when the police announce we're investigating it and then it's announced that Lucy Letby has been arrested. That's why they're in the police station. So I don't think they would have been particularly surprised. I think that, as I've said numerous times, I do think they had genuine suspicions. I think those suspicions were misguided, to say the least. But I think when there were deaths in a short period of time, they were concerned about it. They were right to be concerned about it. They jumped to the wrong conclusions, and some of their conduct was very poor, in my opinion. But they did think something was awry. They did believe something was awry on the unit. Why else would they go into the police station and so forth? I think that the fact that they've backed what Dr. Evans has said in court doesn't reflect very well on them as paediatricians, because it's complete rubbish, basically. It's certainly very poorly founded. That's the most generous thing that you can say. So I don't think they ever had to come up with something. I think Evans provides the medical information on which Lucy's convicted, and what the people from the hospital generally do is say, oh, we had no idea what was going on, we'd never seen anything like this before, there was no rational medical explanation for this, and of course they're wrong. They're completely wrong. And they were completely wrong in their suspicions, and they were completely wrong in everything that they've done. But I believe that what they did, certainly initially, came from a sincere place. Perhaps later on, after the grievance, the document that I've analysed relatively recently that was only released in Thirlwall, that is essentially the conclusion to the grievance procedure. Once that document is out in the public domain and they know about it and they know they're facing disciplinary proceedings and they've been pretty heavily criticised, then I think there can be more of a conscious aspect to what they're doing. And I know I've heard a lot of people say, and I have no reason to disbelieve this, and I certainly cannot disagree with it, because it comes from people that are far more qualified than me. I've heard a lot of people say that perhaps there were problems in the relationship between Lucy and the consultants, particularly Brearey and maybe J-Ram. I have no idea whether that's true or not, but it would give a kind of justification for why they went for Lucy so quickly. There isn't a very good explanation. I can't think of any other even conceivable explanation, in fact. But I think certainly the doctors expected there to be a thorough investigation by the police. Whether they thought the police would find anything wrong, they couldn't possibly know. They couldn't possibly know that the police investigation would be incompetent. I don't think they would have been enormously surprised. I think their general intuition and belief that something had gone wrong and that there may have been foul play involved was genuine. Is there scope to separately decide if a crime occurred separately and before a criminal trial? Well, the answer to this question is that once a court case begins, there's an assumption that a crime has been committed, or at least that's what's being tested in court. Sometimes It's not always the case that there's an assumption the crime has been committed, because sometimes the crime itself is more in debate, obviously. To give an example from a high-profile court case that will be coming up soon, it's debatable whether Russell Brand has committed sexual assault or rape or non-consensual sexual acts. That's what the court will debate. So in those circumstances, obviously he should be regarded innocent until proven guilty. And I mean, I have no opinion on it particularly, but the question that's being asked in court is, did this crime occur? This is, in a way, this is a tricky question to answer, because in a sense, there could theoretically have been a crime at the Council of Chester that wasn't committed by Lucy Letby, or the situation could be, as it is, that there was no crime at the Council of Chester. Now, sometimes, as I mentioned, you have a defendant in a court case and they are being prosecuted or tried on the basis that they are guilty of a crime that we know existed. Andrew Malkinson's case is an example of that, because we know that woman was raped, now someone else has gone to prison based on DNA evidence. Andrew Malkinson was very, very unfortunate, to say the least, to find himself in prison for something they hadn't done. In some circumstances, we know the actions of a person, and a court has to describe, does this constitute a criminal offence or not? Or also sometimes, what is the extent of this criminal offence? So sometimes, is it manslaughter or is it murder, and so on and so forth. Other times there can be several concurrent criminal convictions or counts or accusations, allegations, and a person can be tried against them separately and they can be found guilty on some and not guilty on others. In this particular situation, the problem is that by the time Lucy was in court, realistically, it should have been established whether or not there was a crime at the hospital or not. The problem is, the police went into this, the Crown Prosecution Service went into this, the court went into this, believing that it was a cut or dried situation of either there had been crimes or there hadn't been crimes, whereas it should have been established before the court case even took place that actually there were no crimes, there were no murders at the hospital. This was a hospital unit that should have been closed down, or at the very, very least downgraded as it was. So there is definitely scope to decide if a crime occurred separately and before a criminal trial. Sometimes before it should be established. Sometimes someone is being tried on whether or not there was a crime, so it's part of the court case, and that can absolutely be part of the criminal proceedings. And Ben Myers did try to make this argument, as I mentioned in the previous video. It's just that there's been so many mistakes with the police investigation, in particular, by what happened at the hospital. If you put everything together, you've heard so many people mention the Swiss cheese model on this channel, and it's just this is one of these incredibly unfortunate circumstances where all the holes lined up, all the problems in the system bore down collectively on Lucy Letby. And it's a tragedy, and that's why I've tried to devote as much time as I can to trying to help. The clinical specialists were common to all the deaths. Why weren't those doctors placed under immediate supervision? So a very good question, very valid question. The simple reason for that, very simple explanation, they were more powerful than Lucy, so they controlled the narrative on the unit. They decided, we're not wrong, we can't possibly be in the wrong, we think a nurse is in the wrong. And there was no one strong enough or no one powerful enough to stand up to them and say, hold on a second, you could have cocked up. And it's really difficult for anyone to say to this powerful consultant body, you're in the wrong, you need to look at yourselves, you need to look in the mirror. And that's why everything was put on the nurse, because as we've established on this channel time and time again, unfortunately, although nurses do an important clinical job, very important role in the hospital, they're at the bottom of the food chain, and we know what happens to people at the bottom of the food chain. I wonder if Lucy was more affected emotionally from the increasing mortality due to overtime resulting in burnout compared with other staff who work less hours, and I wonder if her emotional reaction was misinterpreted and twisted. So let's deal with that first before we go on to the next question. Certainly, some of Lucy's reactions were twisted in court. There's no doubt about that. She had this feeling that she wanted to go back on the unit after there'd been a death, and also that she wanted to deal with a vulnerable infant again. Somehow in the court case that was presented as being suspicious or unhealthy, whereas of course particularly wanting to go back on the unit, it's pretty much a case of getting back on the horse, isn't it? I think it was, again, pretty despicable that this was misrepresented as being somehow unsavoury, when in actual fact it's just indicative of a professional attitude towards nursing. So in terms of whether she was more affected emotionally, in fact in court it was presented as the opposite. It was presented that she was less affected emotionally from the increasing mortality, and this is why she wasn't bothered about being back on the unit, whereas others seemingly, supposedly, found it too upsetting. It's certainly possible that Lucy was affected due to working a lot of hours. We don't know, but it's clear that a lot of her reactions were, as you say, misinterpreted and twisted. So the next part of the question is also whether Lucy saw the RCPCH report or not. I wonder if she was at any point advised on her options, inclusive of constructive dismissal and the risks involved in pursuing a grievance. So I would imagine that Lucy saw the RCPCH report, including the section that's now redacted, but we've seen it on her. I would imagine she saw that. Of course, I don't know for certain, but it seems likely that she would have seen that. She was definitely advised of her options. She was definitely advised regarding constructive dismissal because a union representative tells the hospital, look, Lucy's got a good shot at constructive dismissal. So she knows that. Whether she was advised regarding the risks of putting in a grievance, I don't know. Essentially, it's likely, I think, that she was told, look, if you pursue a grievance, you're going to win, or you've got a very good chance of winning. Even though that may have been a naive view based on what we've heard on this channel, based on the how this is essentially unprecedented. So we're not aware of any other example of a nurse pursuing a grievance against consultants and winning, ever. The next question is interesting regarding Dr. Chris Green being not called as a witness. We don't know why this is, but bear in mind that the judge said to a great extent you can't talk about the grievance procedure and you can't talk about the outcome of it. I've decided this is irrelevant. So that would probably be the explanation. It wasn't blocked by Judge Goss, but essentially you'd be going against the what Judge Goss has requested, which is no talking about the grievance procedure. Beyond that, what could Dr. Chris Green offer? So that would probably be the explanation. I know someone has mentioned to me that recently a barrister has been held in contempt of court for going against the instructions of a judge. I haven't followed this case. I don't know the details of this case. I don't even know if that is true, but I assume that it is true because I don't think someone would tell me it's true if it's not. So it's not, you can't necessarily be defiant against a judge. If the judge says, this is what we're going to do, then you must do that. I think it's quite extreme to hold someone in contempt of court for going against a judge's instructions, but that's apparently what has happened. So I think it's quite likely that Lucy wasn't probably or properly informed about the risks involved in putting in a grievance. I think it's certainly possible, in fact we basically know that some of her behaviour was held against her in court, if not on the unit at the time. And I think Dr. Chris Green would have been called as a witness probably, but the ability of the defence to do that was hamstrung by the fact that Judge Goss said, well, you can't say contextual things about this grievance, so there was no reason to call him, unfortunately. Why wasn't Melanie Taylor redeployed and made to have her competencies reviewed? Taylor gave too much caffeine to baby A, causing him to become jittery. She was also present at 7 events according to the shift chart. She was also present on the previous shift for several other babies. Why the different treatment? It does seem Lucy was the only target. Another good question. So there's a lot to unpack there. The first thing I should say is that it's not really my place to be critical of Melanie Taylor because I'm not an expert on nursing, and I'm sure she was trying her best on the unit, and everyone makes mistakes. That's the first thing I feel I need to say. The second thing is that it certainly does seem that Lucy was treated differently. I don't think that we can reasonably disagree with that. I personally believe that there was never any intention of having anyone else review their competencies. This was just a story that Lucy was told. I think to some extent with good intentions. I think the executive team and the nursing team, particularly the nursing team, of course, both felt a great deal of sympathy for her and didn't want to upset her necessarily. In retrospect, they needed to tell her the truth. They needed to tell her why she was being taken from the unit. They needed to say, unfortunately, Lucy, no one else is going to have their competencies addressed because the consultant team has made specific complaints about you. But there was so much politics on the unit, I think it was very difficult for them. And they were trying to tread on eggshells, really, and there were numerous plates to balance, and they didn't want any of them to topple over. And unfortunately, mistakes were made, as was acknowledged. In terms of whether Lucy was the only target, I discussed this earlier. It does seem, based on the discussions I've had with various people, many of them very highly qualified in their fields, that it's quite possible, conceivable, perhaps even probable, that for some reason there was a bit of a personality clash and cultural issues on the unit, which meant that Lucy was the only target. I still believe, fundamentally, that if another nurse had been around a lot, there's a good chance she would have ended up being arrested and investigated instead, because of the way the investigation was structured. But it's possible that if another nurse had been around a lot, because there wasn't this hypothetical personality clash, that the commonality would never have been investigated. But I certainly think we can say very reasonably that Lucy was treated differently, and I think we can also say with considerable confidence there was never any intention of looking at any of the other nurses. If Sally Clark's conviction could have been turned around within 4 years of her conviction in 1999 to her release in 2003 based on new medical evidence, why can Lucy's case not be handled in the same timely manner? Again, another good question. I think perhaps part of the reason is that Lucy's case is more complicated and there's more that needs to be overturned. Whereas in the case of Sally Clark, it all, as far as I'm aware, I'm certainly not an expert on her case, but it all came down to the fact that Meadow had made this very bold assertion about the odds of what had occurred, and that turned out to be completely incorrect. So in the defence of the system, it was so simple to overturn that case, whereas this one is more complex and will require a little bit more time. With that being said, Lucy was convicted. It seems an enormously long time ago, but because it's changed my life and I've been so immersed in it, but it's not yet 3 years ago. So maybe a similar time frame is possible. We'll have to wait and see. But I absolutely take your point. It's a very valid point. It occurs to me that the medical profession, at least the Council of Chester, could learn from the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which specifies a minimum rank of officer for particular actions and decisions. Perhaps it should be unlawful for a consultant not to take certain decisions. It's an interesting suggestion. I think the whole chain of command in a hospital is very strange to me, because ultimately the executives must be responsible for what occurs at the hospital, because in any other company the board is held responsible, and if you're on the board and you don't do a good job, you can be voted off, even if it's your company. There are countless examples of people that own companies, that founded companies, just being voted off the board, and so they have no say whatsoever in the future direction of the company. They may still benefit financially, but they're gone. And that's a normal organisational structure in the commercial sector. Hospitals where it certainly seems at this hospital, and I've heard more broadly that's not unusual, where the consultants almost resent the executives having a voice, and the consultant body's really powerful. It's very strange. Ultimately, the consultants do not run the unit. In practical terms, they obviously exert an enormous influence, but they have a responsibility for the unit, but they're not the name above the door, to use an analogy. They shouldn't be, because ultimately the hospital board is responsible for the running of the hospital. Naturally, they're responsible for the medical side of things. And if they shouldn't get involved beyond that. Of course, it's their responsibility to report certain things medically. It's their responsibility to take certain medical decisions. But they knew that it was the fact that realizing that they're going on and on and on so persistently to the executives to contact the police. The reason they're doing that is because they know they can't do that officially. So the consultants cannot go to the police in an official capacity. What they can go outside of the hospital, which is what they should have done. If they had any courage, they would have done that in the middle of 2016 when Dr. Salady wrote a letter about it. But they didn't have the courage to do it. So what they've done is they've got, quite cleverly, from Brearey in particular, they've got the hospital to refer the case to the police, and they've had their say as well. So they've had their say without taking any risks. But really, it's not their place to make decisions. Similarly, they can't say, right, throw Lucy Letby off the unit. They know it's not their decision. They can call for it to happen, they can put pressure on, but they can't take that decision. So I'm not so sure about this lawful aspect of it, but fundamentally, it's not their place to make these decisions. So they weren't able to make those decisions, and they didn't make those decisions. But what they did was they used political actions and their influence as a consultant body to have a say, and ultimately a decisive say in the direction that things proceeded. What I find most disturbing is that once it reached the courts, there were still enough opportunities to stop proceedings due to insufficient evidence, but they allowed this case to reach guilty verdicts. The question remains why. So I think I can only give my opinion on this, but I feel very confident that I'm correct about this. Once the case is in court, it's going to be enormously embarrassing if they don't manage to see it through to conclusion. If the case collapses for some reason, objectively, Evans should have been removed from the court. Objectively, there was a very good case to have a no case to answer, certainly for some charges, or many charges, in the court case, and that could have had an enormous difference on what occurred. But I think the main factor is just embarrassment, or how embarrassing that would have been for everyone that's involved in the criminal justice system. And I think a small percentage is complacency. I think there is a complacency of thinking, well, this is what we always do. We always have a court case. We always have a defence barrister, prosecuting barrister. There's cross-examination. We have experts. Hell, there's more experts in this case than usual. This must be a great court case. Then there's a load of arguments, and then the jury goes away, and then we send someone down, or sometimes they get off, but not very often, because most of the time courts prosecute people. So I think it's really a combination of those two factors. Yes, it is disturbing. That's a very reasonable description. Could Datix reports be revealed and considered as new evidence in a retrial for Lucy? No, because they were available at the time. Unless something is unearthed that wasn't available at the time for some reason, but it would be very difficult to argue this, I should imagine. It can be used contextually in an appeal, but I don't think it could be considered new evidence as such, because the Datix dates back to 2015, 2016, and the original defence could have got hold of it, I presume. How do you feel about online criticism, or broadly about criticism for what you're doing? So I will comment in the future. I've probably commented in the past about the families. They don't know what I'm doing currently, but they're obviously going to find out about the book, and I will make comments about that. I don't wish to comment about that at this time. In terms of online criticism, I just couldn't care less. I mean, I've spoken about this previously. People are perfectly entitled to say whatever they want. All I do is do my work to the best of my ability and leave it open to people to respond in however way they see fit. And I'm really not concerned what people have to say. I just concentrate on what I'm doing. I've just spotted that the CCRC has added 6 or more commissioners, 2 of which have a medical background. I would assume this may be in response to the requirement for medical experts in the CCRC for cases like Lucy's. What are your thoughts on this, Chris? I did cover this in a previous video, but I'll go over this again and give my overall thoughts. I think the first thing that I would say is the CCRC has made something of a conscious effort to at least optically improve what it's doing, certainly to improve its public image. But I do think if we were to say that it's just lip service to that, I don't think that's fair. I think there has been a decent effort to respond to the fact that they have made some very serious errors in the past. And I do think they're trying to make amends for that, and I do think they're trying to be more efficient and more effective. If I can say something in their defence, they must be careful always not to overturn what is a correct or legitimate verdict. Because the last thing you would want, even though it's inevitable in the system, but you try and avoid it, is for someone that is guilty of a very serious crime to go free. That's going to happen. Inevitably that will happen. But once they've been convicted, you obviously want to avoid freeing someone who's actually guilty. With that being said, the CCRC has lent far too heavily into defending the system, far too heavily. And I think the articles of this gentleman writing in The Independent, who used to work for the CCRC, is emblematic of the attitude of those that have worked for the CCRC. It seems that there have been serious efforts to make amends for this, and I do applaud those, but now the proof is going to be in the pudding of how they actually deal with cases going forward. With regard to whether the medical commissioners are a response to Lucy's case, it seems extremely likely that they are. And I think it's an absolute certainty that they'll be working on that case, and it will be the first thing on their desks. Why is the CCRC taking so long? Well, firstly, it's a complicated case, very complex case. They have to look at the reports that have been submitted. They have to look at those reports seriously. And they're under-resourced and understaffed, which doesn't help. That's basically the reason. Typically, the criminal justice system moves slowly, and it's possible there's some institutional resistance to this case being overturned and being overturned quickly. I can't possibly know whether that's the case or not, but those are the only possible reasons. It's clear that they need to act and act quickly, and I'm hopeful it'll be referred this year. Thank you for having the wonderful Michelle Warden. Do you think the case, including the case against the manager, will be taken away from Cheshire Police? It seems that the local CPS are no longer involved in making decisions in these cases. Would you agree that a local constabulary/CPS will not be allowed to be in charge of a mass murder case by medical professional disputed medical evidence? So quite a few questions there. It seems the Cheshire Police are proceeding with this manslaughter criminal case. Yes, they've been taken away from the local CPS, but I've seen no evidence that Cheshire Police are going to have the case taken away from them. So it seems that it will proceed with Cheshire Constabulary doing the investigation. It's very hard to say what will happen in the future in terms of whether a local constabulary will be prevented from being in charge of a mass murder case by a medical professional or disputed medical evidence, but it's clear that should happen. It's clear that there needs to be a specialist body that's involved in investigating such cases, and it's also clear that there needs to be a medical panel that deals with the evidence before it gets anywhere near the criminal justice system and the police. That's very obvious to me. That's what should have happened in this case. Why that didn't happen was because of the consultants pushing and pushing and pushing until it was referred to the police. The executives couldn't possibly have known what a pig's ear the police would make of the case, but a lot of that is because they're out of their depth, and that means there needs to be a specialist unit that specialises in such cases, that is absolutely requisite. However, that doesn't mean that it will actually happen in the real world. So whether or not that will occur, I couldn't say. All I can say is that I will try to use whatever voice I have to expose this in the future. And I do wish to write another book about Lucy's case, talking about the lessons that we can learn from it. When that will happen, when it'll be released, when it'll be the right time, I don't know. But it's certainly a project that is on my radar. Did Hummingbird know about Lucy Letby winning a grievance against her accusers, and if so, which way did it influence their decision to focus on her? I think we can reasonably assume that they didn't know about that because they didn't make any effort to seek out that information. They've made very little effort based on what we've seen to understand the contextual information, the climate at the hospital at the time that these incidents had taken place. If that isn't the case, they can prove that by releasing the decision logs and documents related to the inquiry. I don't expect them to do that, and the reason they won't do that is because those logs would confirm what I've just stated. I don't think for 1 second that they knew about the grievance, and if they ever did find out about the grievance, it would have been way into their investigation. When they'd already decided they were going to investigate Lucy Letby, the wheels had been set in motion, and they would have just completely ignored it. So in terms of how it influenced their decision to focus on Lucy, it didn't influence it at all because I don't think they knew about it. And I think that the decision, although that wasn't taken consciously, it's just an incompetent investigation, but the decision to focus on Lucy would have certainly been taken by the time that they did find out about the grievance procedure, if indeed they ever heard about it at all. I see the Thirlwall Inquiry is delayed again, and I have a theory that this is an intentional delay. Lady Thirlwall would prefer to wait for the CCRC decision. This may give her enough time to write 2 reports and just publish the one that's less embarrassing to her. What is your view? I never thought previously that she would write 2 reports and then publish the least embarrassing one. It's an interesting theory. I don't know if she would really do that. I think more likely is, well, as I've said previously, we'll never see the report. I don't want to go into this deeply again because I've gone over this in a recent video. I just don't think we'll ever see that report. But your idea is quite intriguing and ingenious. I suppose it's not completely inconceivable, but what I would suggest to you about human nature is that if people can do half the work or double the work, they'll typically do half the work. So I think more likely is that she'll just say, I can't put this report out, and then eventually be referred, then we'll just never see it. What are your thoughts on the new insulin study? It's critically important. It's really, I wouldn't go as far as to say it's a silver bullet, but it's a very, very important item of new scientific information that renders the results in the original trial unsafe and inaccurate. It's very, very important, and I will be going into it in more depth in my book. It's certainly not simple, but actually everything that is written in the study is documented. It's all there so that you can understand it. So it's important because essentially what it says is the presumptions that were made about the insulin results are wrong. Given the other aspects of the science are also wrong, that puts Lucy in a strong position. We just have to hope that the court can understand this. But as I said, I'm increasingly optimistic about the situation. It just is a case of time frame. Is the recent turmoil in the Labour Party and government good news for Lucy? Do you have a view on this? Again, I've covered this relatively recently, so I won't go into as much depth as I did in that video, but I'm broadly speaking fairly ambivalent about this because I'm not enormously optimistic that whoever wins the leadership election will do anything, and we know that Keir Starmer won't do anything, or it seems pretty clear that he won't do anything. So I don't think it's good news for Lucy. I don't think it's bad news for Lucy. I don't think it's going to make an enormous amount of difference. I may be being naive, but surely it's the role of the judiciary, Thirlwall, to get to the truth. Having sat through the wealth of evidence in the review, my feeling is that Thirlwall will seriously doubt the verdict. If she keeps delaying the report, then eventually the CCRC will make a decision and the premise of the report will be undermined. Lucy will be exonerated, but we and the rest of the public will demand sight of the report. Surely better that Thirlwall publishes a report, even though it may be proved to be worthless. At least you could say that she carried out her review on the understanding that Lucy was guilty. So, some interesting points there. The problem with publishing the report is that she's supposed to publish recommendations alongside the report. So if she publishes recommendations based on a report that she knows to have no value, and those recommendations make requirements of the NHS, and those requirements turn out to be potentially dangerous, that's not a fantastic state of affairs, obviously. So I think there's no prospects, I said, that the report will be published for those reasons. In terms of whether Lady Thirlwall doubts the verdict, she must have some feelings about this. She's obviously had a letter from experts. She knows there are many more experts. She knows it's becoming a bigger story all the time. But I think these legal people typically are very good at just compartmentalizing. They don't get emotionally involved, perhaps. I'm sure they would say, I mean, that's not entirely fair. But they seem to me, as an outsider, looking at what they do, it seems to me that they are very, very good and very capable and required, indeed, to just sit there and think, this is my job, I'm going to do my job to the best of my ability. It's irrelevant what the truth is, irrelevant what my feelings are. I'm just here to be part of the legal system. So, although there are reasons to doubt the verdict, Lady Thirlwall is a product of a system in which your job is just to do your job without questioning anything else, really. And I'm sure there are moments where they have feelings. I'm sure there are moments where they question what they've done. I'm sure there are moments when they feel emotional about things. But I don't think she's probably sitting there every day thinking, is Lucy Letby innocent? This is terrible. I think she's more likely to be thinking, oh my God, I've agreed to front this inquiry and the terms of reference are completely inadequate and I'm in a complete mess now. So I do believe this will be delayed until the CCR make a decision, and I'm pretty sure she's waiting for that so she can say, sorry, we have to shelve this report now. Something I've never seen addressed, although I may have missed it somewhere, the insulin cases were found by Dr. Brearey. Was there ever any questioning on the disclosure process in terms of how many cases did he look through, how many gave positive results, etc.? How do we know he didn't cherry-pick cases based on Letby's shifts, etc.? So, I've never seen any indication of any disclosure or any indication of how many cases he looked at, and so on and so forth. We don't know that he didn't cherry pick cases. I'm not saying that he definitely did, because it's impossible for me to say that, but it's obviously something that just simply shouldn't have happened. He shouldn't have been reviewing medical information. He shouldn't have been involved in the investigation. He shouldn't have been involved in the selection of cases. It's completely unacceptable. It's really bad practice. Frankly, it's utterly ludicrous. How they could possibly think that was appropriate, it just shows what a shoddy job Cheshire Police did. I don't blame Dr. Brearey. You know, he was asked to do it and he did it. We don't know what kind of job he did. We don't know how objective he was. We will probably never know. All we do know, and all we can say confidently, is that he should have been involved, and that is a police matter, and the police screwed up really badly. Were the deviant results for insulin and C-peptide noticed at the time they were, I guess this is, acquired, and was there any action taken? The answer to that question is that they were noticed by the laboratory, but they were not noted by the Council of Chester. The laboratory flagged them for the Council of Chester and said that there needed to be follow-up action taken in Guildford. This action was not taken, and there was no action taken in the Council of Chester, and it wasn't deemed suspicious, and they weren't in the original bundle of cases, of course. So that pretty much answers the question, really. It was all retrospective after the fact, and nothing could be confirmed, the bags had gone, etc., etc. It's all entirely hypothetical. Can't wait to have my copies of Chris's book delivered. This needs nationwide publicity. Are British, especially numerically English nurses being jailed for fabricated events about to be added to by a case brewing in Birmingham? So again, I dealt with this recently, but I will go over this again because I think it's very important. Firstly, thank you for the support with regard to my book. It's very much appreciated. Obviously, there's this nurse who's supposedly still under investigation who has worked in Birmingham, and we don't quite know what's going to happen with her. That investigation has dragged on for several years, and yet the authorities won't say, well, we're definitely charging her, and they won't say, well, we're definitely not charging her. As far as we know, it could be they've already dropped the investigation and just not told anyone, but certainly she hasn't been charged. Now, I suspect that we won't hear anything more about that. I suspect it will drift away steadily over a period of time, because I suspect that the authorities, the police in Birmingham, are watching this very closely, the Lucy Letby case, that is, and they're not going to make any decision until this is resolved, which could still take a certain number of years. We don't know how long it's going to take, and by that time, it will be very, very difficult, very, very controversial to charge this nurse, given that they began the investigation I believe, in 2022. It seems to me that the investigation is likely to be very similar to the Lucy Letby case, and it's absolutely crystal clear and certain that they don't have any concrete evidence, because if they had any concrete evidence, they already would have charged her, and rightly so. Given that they haven't charged her, we can assume they don't have concrete evidence. They probably don't have strong circumstantial evidence. I will be extremely surprised if the evidence is anything other than what we've seen previously in the Lucy Letby case and other nurse cases of, oh, we don't like these figures, let's have a look, oh, this nurse is around quite a bit, let's just blame everything on her and assume that she's attempted to murder people or actually murdered them. We know by now the methodology related to this is completely awry, errant, illegitimate, essentially. So I think over time this will drift away. Unfortunately, they've already ruined the nurse's life, but, what can you do? I cannot even start to imagine how the parents must be feeling. I read recently that some of the inquest have been postponed until 2027. That's 11 years after their baby died. How can anyone grieve and heal with this open sore? Well, I don't think they can. I don't think they ever will. Probably it'll always be. Can you ever truly heal from the death of a child? I don't know. It's not really for me to say. They've been misled and they've been dragged through a process that never needed to happen, which is very regrettable. And what's worse, obviously, is that they have beliefs about their children that are wrong. That's a tragedy. And as you say, now the inquests have been pulled back further. And of course, Lucy will be exonerated one day. That won't feel great for them, and they may never be able to accept that she's innocent. I don't know. All I can say is that the police must take significant responsibility for what has occurred here. So the next question is related to the parents as well. Have any parents joined the campaign to free Lucy Letby? Their voices would be extremely valuable in this fight against a miscarriage of justice. They haven't, but I do think that the mother of child D, who was treated fairly poorly, I would say, and would have a very good case for compensation against the hospital, I believe that she must have doubts at this point regarding what she's heard. So of all the parents, I believe she is probably the most likely to recognise that, hold on a second, what I've heard about my infant is either untrue or incomplete. But at this point in time, the parents, all having been through an incredibly emotional experience, all still believe that justice has been done in court. Whether any of them could ever possibly change their mind or not, I don't know. Ultimately, we have very little control over that. I hope that eventually some of them can heal enough that they're able to look at the reports, look at the whole issue dispassionately, if such a thing is possible, and understand that Lucy Letby did not harm their children. So finally, thanks Chris, well presented, very informative. One point, Charles Dickens was no fan of the British legal system. Bleak House paints a poor picture of a legal system that is there to make big sums of money at their clients' expense. He shows that many in the legal system were little better than parasites, though there were some possible heroes as well, like Mr. Jaggers in Great Expectations. My point being, though these are fictional books, they indicate that the legal system may not have been that good in the 19th and early 20th century either. So I wanted to, a good point, very interesting comment, but I wanted to highlight this because I've mentioned Dickens a few times, and it's notable that Dickens was a pessimist, basically. He's often seen now as a great social reformer or someone who wrote about poverty and injustice, and absolutely he did, one of the great authors of all time. However, he was never optimistic about the system, and he was never optimistic that the system would change. And what he tended to depict in his novels, as this poster mentions, were some heroes, some people of good nature who did the right thing within the system and made things better and made a difference. But he was never optimistic about the system changing. And that is reflective of the situation that exists today, where it's very, very difficult to change this legal system or any broad aspect of the social and political system that's been in place for a long time in a country that considers itself to have at least contributed significantly to giving the world civilization. And it's very difficult to hope that there will be change, but that change is needed. It's just as needed now as it was in the day of Dickens, and I hope that when the Lucy Letby case inevitably unravels, that it can be a real catalyst in getting the change that is so sorely needed. So that's all I have to say in this particular video. I'll look forward to receiving comments. If you have any questions, please leave them and I'll do another one of these next month. Or if you have questions in other videos, please leave them and I'll try to collate them. That process is getting trickier as I go along, so I have less time to do it, but I always manage to get enough together to have one a month, and I'll continue to answer your questions whenever I can. I'm going to have a really busy June coming up. I don't know. I'm going to try to keep the channel going the way I've been doing it, but it's possible I might have to change tack at some point. I don't know. I just know that I've got a lot of things in my calendar already, and it may be impossible to keep going. With that being said, I will have finished my book, the writing-wise, completely, and it'll be with a printer, and that job will be done. But I then do have to spend a week recording the audiobook. It takes 5 days. So I'm not sure what YouTube is going to look like, and it's difficult for me to keep up with everything, but I do the best that I can, and I'm hopeful I'll be able to keep it going. At some point in the future, I will just be able to concentrate on YouTube, and then I've got so many ideas for videos that I haven't been able to do because they're more involved than what I've been able to do, but I'm doing the best that I can anyway. And I really appreciate your support throughout this whole time. So with that being said, I look forward to reading your comments, and thank you for watching.